Say It Loud Network presents Corner Table Talk.
Well, welcome everyone to Corner Table Talk. Today, my esteemed guest is an old friend of mine and a reasonably recognizable name and face these days, none other than Chef Marcus Samuelsson. Marcus is best known recently for the Red Rooster, but Marcus owns and operates restaurants around the world. He's just an incredible, dynamic speaker, entrepreneur, operator, chef, and he also happens to be husband to the very lovely Maya and proud papa to his son Zion. So, Chef, welcome to Corner Table Talk. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Brad. I'm really excited about this. And let's chop it up.
So I get started, Marcus, with a little, you'll appreciate this, a little restaurant terminology. I call it the short order questions.
Yeah.
So I'm going to fire a few at you that shouldn't be too difficult for you to elaborate a little bit on, but just to give us a little flavor and get rolling. So first one, what is in heavy rotation on your playlist these days?
Oh, I would like to say I'm hipper than that, but I'm still listening to Prince and Bob and Marvin and Aretha the most. But then I got a little bit, I got it played up a little bit. I got to change up some. I heard about this new band, Earth Gang, that's from Atlanta. People have been calling them the new ACAST. Oh, wow. Whenever everyone say they're the new ACAST, I've heard that term so many times. I'm like, there can never be another ACAST. But these guys are really talented, so I'm listening to a little bit of that. And also a lot of Afrobeats, what Fela started and looking at the next generation, what the kids are doing today, where it's really blended all African sounds with hip hop and reggaeton and all of that. So I'm all over with music, but music is on 24/7. When I go to run, when I think about food, when I take my son out, music is everywhere for me.
Isn't it the greatest accompaniment, man? I don't know what I would do without music in my life. And by the way, I'm loving Angelique Kidjo. She's someone I discovered a few years ago and just absolutely love her. And also Miriam Makeba has been coming back to me in heavy rotation. So yeah, those couple. All right. So I know you're a very fashionable, dapper gentleman. What is your desired footwear these days?
My buddy just sent me these pair of Vans that, these skater shoes. So, and I was just, how it is when you have a friend doing something, realizing their vision. Like, I remember when you were telling me about this podcast and now you're doing it. And my friend Chris, he was doing this project together with Vans. So now he's doing it, right? So for me, I take so much joy when my creative friends can realize their vision. So when Chris sent me his pair of Vans, I was like, I'm all in. I'm rocking them. Chris is part of this,
I love that. Are they comfortable?
Yeah. No, not only do they look good, of course, but they're comfortable. And it's interesting you say that about fashion. Yeah, I don't know nothing about fashion. No, but honestly, people say that fashion, I was like, absolutely not. I love style. And it's a different thing. I think as Blackness, as, being connected to the continent, style is everywhere.
Right.
And the style that you could draw from the continent is very often, with very little, we can do much, right? Whether it's colors, whether our fabrics. And, it's also the tradition of, as Black men, we have to dress a certain way. Mm-hmm. Because if we wear a hoodie, we have enough example of what happened. I always think about that. I teach my son, we always have to look dapper, and he's just 5, and but it does have an undertone of reality too.
No question. And I appreciate the distinction between fashion and style. Fashion suggests something that's temporary, that's dictated by someone else or trend. Yeah. Style is what are you comfortable rolling in, right?
And our uncles, my uncles, I always call them uncles, but they're not really my uncles, but the people that I adored coming up, right? They were so stylish, like Bob, he wasn't fashionable, but he was stylish. Fela Kuti had style, although he never had a shirt on. Marvin had crazy style. Miles had style. So all these icons, Prince, Sly and the Family Stone, all of them for me are and it goes back to that time where we grew up with albums. Right. And the album was a whole event. It was, it's not like now when you download, so you miss some of that aesthetic, right? the front of an album, the backside of an album, pulling it out. So all of that for me connects style, you know?
Yeah, man. Yeah, I love that, Marcus. Thank you. All right. Where do you and Maya go for a romantic dinner?
You know, my favorite place is when we can go to Jamaica and eat on the beach, you know, and there's nothing like Ja. You know, I think as Africans, I think Jamaica speaks to us in a different way, right? It's far to fly to Africa, but Jamaica is just a couple of hours away. And once you land, there's something about the connectivity there with that island that I feel like I'm home. Mm-hmm. And sitting on the beach in the grill and just eating a simple jerk something, or eating in the morning, having breakfast, and it can be ackee and salt. It's very basic things. And it's just that I love that. I just love that.
Yeah, man, I feel you on that one. So is there a time of day that you feel you have most access to your creative energy? I know you're a busy guy, you go 24/7, but you always seem to be very present too in the moment. But is there an energy time for you that you call on?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would say really mornings. You know, my son gets us up sometimes too early, but early. And once he's good and sort of in his way, whether it's getting ready for school, there is always that slot where I can actually start thinking about it. And it always go back to food to me, you know, always. And then the people, but it's food comes first, you know, and I'm still in awe and love with these things that salt, sweet, sour, bitter, heat, umami. These 6 things I've been chasing flavors all my life and still doing it. And at our age, the fact you can do something that you're passionate about and still be passionate about it. Mm-hmm. It's a privilege. You know?
It sure is, man. It sure is. All right. So last one, Marcus, and this may be the toughest one. What is your favorite walk in New York City?
My favorite walk?
Walk. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, that is not a tough one. It is around Central Park. And it's linked back to sharing it with my son, but also when I came to New York. You know how it is. We all done it. You come to New York, you have no money. And I say no money, no money. So you go to a place like Central Park where you can be part of the Saturday roller skater or rollerbladers, or you can be part of a jazz concert because somebody's performing, or you can see hip hop breakdancers, and you are getting this incredible postcard of New York City for free.
Right.
And eventually, as you have a little money, you start, of course, tipping and being participating. But specifically those early years when you don't have a dime, but you're happy. You have 4 roommates and you're happy, and 5 roommates or whatever it is. But you go to Central Park and the city is for you. So it'll always be that. The park,
and it's free, right?
And it's free.
Yeah. I love that, man. All right. So diving in here a little bit. And again, man, thank you so much for taking the time. I can't imagine what your schedule is like these days. And, you know, I really appreciate you joining us here, and congratulations on the rise. It's the cookbook that Marcus just put out is just so much more than a cookbook. It's really a culinary roadmap that has been long overdue, and so many folks acknowledge. And it's really a beautiful, beautiful piece of work, Marcus. So we'll talk about that in a few, but I want to check in first. How's your family doing? It's been an interesting year. How's everybody?
You know, we're blessed, and it's been tough, like for everybody. And I would probably answer it by compartmentalizing. Those first 3 months there from March to July, it was a shock to the system. And the amount of fear for getting the virus, can I work? How do we provide? All of that was just mixed up. I was nervous about this. Then once I was really inspired by the social justice conversation that America was having over the summer. It's just horrible they had to go through these horrible, painful, horrible incidents, right? Whether it was Breonna Taylor or George Floyd. But once sort of late summer, early fall kicked in, we have now systemized that. And it's incredible how as human beings, how quickly we adapt. And now this is the new normal. And now we're coming back out of it. We're still not out of it. But yeah, Brad, we We lost a lot in terms of restaurants, but we can build that back. And Maya and Zion and I, we stayed healthy. And that's when you realize you're privileged. We have access to health care. And just walking those 5 minutes between my house and Red Rooster, you see America. You see the haves and the don'ts have. That really inspired me to know what we had to do. We had to start serving our community. And that's what we did. We've served over 250,000 meals with World Central Kitchen since we started.
Yeah, I've read about that, Marcus, and that's just phenomenal, man. But that's what you do, sir. You know, I read somewhere that the restaurant industry was estimated to lose about $240 billion in sales, and that your group large, and I think your sales were estimated at somewhere around 75 million, and might have experienced as much as an 80% drop due to COVID. That's a lot of revenue to lose, but that's a lot of business. You were doing 4,000 meals a week at Red Rooster. I mean, that's just incredible. So, and you say, Marcus, I've also read where you think that it's going to take, 5 to 6 years to build back in our industry from what we lost. That's quite an uphill climb. Question: How many people did you employ pre-pandemic across all of your restaurants? Would you estimate?
Yeah, I mean, so most of those restaurants are in partnership and so on. So direct employees, the group is not that big, but people that work with me and with the restaurants that we've built up were between 15 to 1,700. In 8 different countries. It's not. You can't look at this as what we have lost. Mm-hmm. Because we have the privilege of being healthy and we have the privilege of being able to navigate through this. And he's talking to somebody that came to this country with $300. And I was equally happy when I had $300 or nothing in my pocket. So this is the big reset. And we all had to get a haircut and take a dip. So if this is what happened to us, okay, but we're going to be okay. Right. And we will rebuild. I have the privilege to rebuild in something that I'm still in love with, is hospitality industry, serving people, putting people together. So, I feel like my blessings as a Black man is that I share as Black people. We've gone through many pandemics. My blessing as an immigrant is that I come from a very simple background and I don't need a lot. Mm-hmm. And I'm inspired to move forward. I cannot look back on what we lost. It's not healthy for me.
Right. Well, you kind of answered a bit of my next question, but I'll frame it in this way and ask it anyway. With so many people under your employ and looking to you for leadership, how have you managed to communicate that message or the message that you'd like to across the board? And how have you, kind of rallied your troops?
Yeah, I mean, I remember those first months, on a personal level, I just wanted to throw my phone away because every phone call was a negative phone call, right? And Brad, it took me 25 years to build and 10 days to break down the whole thing. And that also forced you to ask yourself questions, like how could you build something that took so much hard work to build up collectively, not just me, the whole group. And it was that the pandemic just broke it down like a tornado in just 10 days, ripped through it. So as we're coming out of it slowly, I'm going to build this a little bit different, right? And I've learned a lot. So I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that we're going to build it a little bit different. We all done it, right? We are social distance, but we're still social. We've been able to do cooking classes online the way we never done them before. So there's new ways to work as a chef. And being fortunate to have a brand and being fortunate to have a restaurant here in Miami, where I'm right now in Overtown, you just a privilege to be able to work and communicate through food. It's a blessing. Now, it was rough. The Swedish team, they have a different system. So I knew the people that we flew there have a government structure that was in place. And remember what happened a year ago, right? We had to build the system at the same time as we had a very confusing message coming out of our government, right? So in Sweden, at least in Sweden, I knew my employees, they would get 70% of their salary based on the tax system and all based on the way Sweden's governed. That's not fantastic, but at least I know they're going to be okay. We have places in London and in Canada as well, similar. Again, it was only really America where we are a modern country, but we have very little safety measures, right? And it's hard, Brad, as you know, to build something at the same time as you need it. That's why most modern countries have built this security system since the Second World War, right? So they're 50 years ahead of us when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to a safer system for their citizens. And we are now building that up. It's not perfect, but imagine if we would have 55, 70 years to build on it versus, when Obama started it in 2012.
It's a work in progress. And I want to come back, Marcus, because I know that you just opened in Overton and I obviously operate in New York, and I want to get your take because I've watched Los Angeles closely and different states have reacted differently. You're right. There was no national plan. So everybody was kind of left to fend for themselves, and it's been a bit schizophrenic, which has made it even harder for operators to respond to. But before I do that, I'm just curious for you personally, and I think I kind of know the answer, but how do you keep your spirits up with so many people looking to you for leadership and guidance and the uplift? What fortifies you?
Well, I think there's two sides to that. There's the true personal side where my family, with my son, my wife, and I get tired like everybody else, and I get down like everybody else. Once I leave the house, it's all forward because it's like, you have to, because the dishwasher, the cooks, the bartenders, the barbacks, the managers, they joined us. Yeah. And when you own a restaurant, it's like a tribe. Everyone in that tribe, the night cleaner,
all the energy is connected. We all feed off of each other. Yes. They
feed off each other, and the person that sells you the strawberries to the salmon, whatever it might be, we're all in this together. So when they can't trade with you anymore and when they can't trust that they have this place anymore, you feel like the leader, like you let everybody down. Mm-hmm. And the pandemic wasn't our fault, but still, end of the day, it creates this crack. And so I felt they trusted me and I couldn't deliver on that. And on a personal level, that was very, very hard. But again, there's no point of dwelling on it too much because Maya and I, we're fortunate enough to be, we're financially going to be able to navigate through this. And we have access to health care. So I was just thinking about the people that had it tougher. So that's really where my father was a tribe leader in Ethiopia. And I looked at him a lot. He's not with us anymore, but watched him. How did he navigate through getting water into a village that didn't have access to water? My Swedish dad, he was the first person to go to university in his village. He come from a fishing village. I remember as a child watching adult men and women coming into the house. My father had to read paperwork for them, sign for them. I've watched leadership within my own family from a very, very different point of view. And I'm fortunate enough to have those experiences to draw from.
It all fortifies you, Marcus. As you're speaking about that, I take myself back to, nights in various restaurants over the years where business did not come through the door. And I sat there where I would normally have dinner and my stomach was too upset to eat. And I felt the staff, moving in slow motion and people looking at me like, man, is this place going to make it? And I think what you're talking about, we draw strength from those experiences that fortify us in times when we have to call on that reserve. And of course, you talk about your dad and our ancestors and the struggles that they had. When we look at that in the context of what we have to deal with, I think that we get a little wind in our sails and we're able to keep pushing. Mm-hmm. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And we've all gone through that. As chefs and restaurateurs, you learn more from the restaurant that you close than the restaurants you open. And that pain that you're talking about, it's real. We've all gone through that because when you open a restaurant, the excitement of the possibilities, then when they are not matched for whatever reason, the location, you couldn't execute, somebody fell sick, somebody you were supposed to work with and not work with, the 50 different reasons of the why, right? And it's painful. And we've all had those, I've definitely had my share. And you have to go through that. So when people always say, oh, the Red Rooster is so busy, I'm like, the journey, man. I had to close a lot of places before I did get to that.
You have no idea, right? So, Marcus, let's turn back to the subject of, and I don't mean to get into a political discussion. We can separate our observations about the way that different states handled the pandemic and the opening and closings and what have you. I've been spending time in Florida as a result. And by the way, have driven past, haven't had dinner yet at Red Rooster, but it looks amazing. And I've heard people say it's just an absolutely gorgeous room. I'm not surprised. And I know you've got a little ice cream business that I also hope to patronize there. But, I'm still in touch with John Cleveland. We sold the restaurant to our chef in LA, and we were mentoring him. So I've been very close to the openings and closings and what that has meant for operators trying to navigate that process in LA. You bring staff back, you let staff go, you put up a tent. Now you can't pay the cost. You've got inventory. Now you don't have business. It's just been like, a yo-yo. Yet I was in South Beach a few months ago. My son came to visit and people were out. Prime 112 was busy. Everybody wore masks and there was, reasonable social distancing. And I'm not saying there's no risk in that. But when you look at the devastation to businesses that was caused, and we'll stick with our industry, to restaurants, that was caused by the states trying to figure out and navigate their way. How do you see that? You operate a restaurant in Miami now, and I think you were able to open your doors sooner there than perhaps you were able to have indoor dining in New York. How do you view that, Marcus?
I would say that, first of all, the pandemic horrible and really pulls the curtain on, how it impacts Black communities and Latin communities and the despair. Brad, 41% of all Black businesses closed due to COVID. 41%. And majority of those are mom and pop, stores with less than 10 employees, where these were stores where they sent their kids to college. They created a middle class living out of these mom and pop stores. 41% of them are closed. And as you know, we don't have access to generational wealth. We don't really have access to traditional money as well. So how and when is that going to come back? What's going to happen to our communities? Yes, we're rolling out the vaccine now, but how that will impact our community. So that's why I say it will take 10 years for us to fully come back to December of 2019, right? In terms of opening, we opened Red Rooster, we closed, we opened, we closed. It was this uncertainty of back and forth. But I'm proudly to say on December 15, we opened the doors here in Overtown. And obviously, the weather has a huge impact, right? The fact that we have 75 degrees in the evening even. And the key part here is that Red Rooster Overtown, we built a patio before the pandemic. That's 90 seats. So our dining room, people are not really, I would say if we do 150, 200 covers, that's over 90 seats in the patio. So we seat that only a time and a half, and we start serving much earlier, for example, right? So we have to do similar to get to the numbers we needed to get to stay open. We just have to tweak our business a little bit. And our dining room that we spend so much on and have this incredible, beautiful art is a place where people walk through and are part of. And sometimes some people want to sit inside, but they sit far apart from each other. So without that patio, we could not be open, right? The business that we don't have is actually where I'm doing this recording, is our upstairs, is that group business that is so vital to restaurants, that corporate business. So when is that coming back? I don't know. There's no point of even guessing. But I'm fortunate and blessed to have the core business. We have about 90 employees here now in Overtown, and be able to create jobs in the middle of the pandemic is one of the proudest things I've ever been part of. And we all feeding of positive environments, right? And this was right for us. It might not be right for somebody else. The right decision would have been maybe to stay close and wait it out. Us being in this climate, knowing that we wear a mask, knowing that we have the patio, this was the right decision for us after many trials and errors. Now,
I know that the process of getting that property where Red Rooster is in Overtown was quite a lengthy process. And the community and things had to develop for the time to be right for you to open there. And just as fate would have it, as you had completed hiring and the anticipation was like through the roof for this place, the pandemic hit. And I remember reading the feeling of having to tell all the young, enthusiastic folks who were so excited about this place, we're not going to be able to open. And how was that experience for you, man? What did that feel like? And now that you've come back, have you been able to bring a lot of those folks back?
Yeah, I mean, one of the saddest days was when we had to furlough people. But You know, Brad, also the way we hire people that very often come back. We hire people from all aspects of society. Mm-hmm. And the toughest was, say there was no jobs for people that live in shelters, people that are food insecure, right? Because for them, it wasn't just another restaurant opening. For them was the only job that they had access, right? And I couldn't wait to hire the crew team back, but a lot of them were gone. We couldn't find them. And that's what it looks like in our communities, right? That maybe everybody doesn't have a traditional, some don't have traditional IDs, but, Red Rooster was also part of them coming back and getting a chance to get a job and eventually be part of something. It wasn't tough for me, for that 24-year-old healthy kid that could go and work somewhere else, right? He or she, they would be all right because there's always somewhere we can work in the industry. But a lot of our staff has a different journey, and I take a lot of pride in hiring people from all aspects. And that was painful because I knew those choices that they had were tough. But I'm proud of the family that we have here now. We're 90 people deep, open 7 days a week, dinner only, with 2 really busy brunches Saturday and Sunday. And we just humbly chipping at it, just working away.
Go ahead, man. Well, Marcus, what you're doing really is you're kind of symbolic of your own version of restorative justice. And by that, I mean, when you look at the community of Overtown and you know the history of the highway that basically was built through the center of this at one time vibrant Black community, dividing it, and then economic hardships, which, also plagued South Los Angeles and Harlem, and drugs, and whether or not it was a conspiratorial genocide, because I know growing up in New York, the drug trade along 8th Avenue, which is Central Park West, North, basically, was vibrant. And it was a block away from the police precinct. You could drive down 123rd Street and buy whatever you want without getting out of your car. You can't tell me that, the police weren't aware of that as well, but, it was allowed to happen. Anyway, so when you take on a project like Red Rooster, as you did in Harlem after Bill Clinton had opened up an office building. And I remember reading around the time that he then took an office subsequent to that in the financial district, how a lot of people were disappointed that he wasn't more helpful to business uptown. It was really Red Rooster in Harlem where you captured the most beautiful moment with the absolute right restaurant, you as the trained, talented, charismatic spokesperson that rode that wave. And I see the same thing in Overtown, that here's another Black community that was left behind, right? So the restorative justice part to me is you riding in and putting this beautiful place on the map for the community, hiring the community. How does that feel, man? And you were new to these shores. I mean, you didn't grow up here, but that's been the role that you are playing now.
Yeah, I mean, I see part of that story very, very, having lived that story, I see that a little bit different. I would say that, first of all, Black culture, when you grew up as a Black person in the diaspora, and you think about America, you think about Black excellence, you think about Harlem, right? So a game-changing moment in my life was when my father gave me Alex Haley, Malcolm X, right? So I was a teenager, and you start seeing yourself in a completely different light. You start to become different between being a young boy to a man, right? And walking the streets. And now, eventually I knew that I would live in Harlem. Maybe not at that moment, but I moved to Harlem 2002, and the community constantly asked me, how come you don't open the restaurant? That I'm not ready. And I remember when my dad took his PhD in geology, it took him 8 years. It took me 8 years between 2002, living in Harlem, 2010, opening Red Rooster. And it wasn't that I wasn't ready to cook. I just didn't know enough of what I needed to know. So I wanted to study. I need to speak to Thelma Golden about the art. I knew we would have Black art, but I need to know the journey. I need to speak to Beverly Smith about what was what. I need to learn from Wood Bay and Gordon Parks and what should the photography look like. I needed to understand that the best cornbread in our culture is not always in restaurant. It can be in after church programs. I have to go to that church. I need to understand which gospel choir. We have 2 gospel bands at Red Rooster. And you don't know that by emailing someone to that. You have to experience that, right? So everything you see on the walls and all the things that you hear and everything you read on the menu, it was all learned on that journey. And now it's the team's job to really upload that and broadcast that and execute on that in the best way possible. But, so it was an 8-year walk before we even had opened the doors. Same thing here in Overtown. This couldn't have happened without a lot of people coming together. The city of Miami, the city of, the Overtown CRA, the Simpkins family. This was a 4-year walk. So, yeah, we had a horrible year that happened, the year that we were supposed to open, but it's not going to define us. Right. And I got inspired from the civil rights movement, right? When you think about people walked, the bus strikes, for example, that didn't happen for 3 months, 4 months, 6 months. It's long time. So everything that is great has taken much, much, much longer time than you think. And you know that. But when the customer sees, it's sometimes just what's ready. I don't mind it taking 4 years because everything with meaning takes a long time.
I want to come back to something that you said because I want to ask you to clarify, because I can see where a statement might be misconstrued from what you intend to what the message is that's conveyed. And, I'll personalize that as a person who grew up in the restaurant business. My dad had a place for close to 20 years, starting in the early 70s, and the Upper West Side became a haven for Black nightlife when Harlem was, had fallen out of favor in drugs, and it was just not a great place to open business. The Upper West Side for a period of, 15 to 20 years had 4 to 5 Black owned restaurant, bar, nightlife, live venue. I mean, it was a vibrant, crazy, cool scene that didn't get a lot of documentation, in mainstream media. Certainly Audrey Bernard at Amsterdam News wrote about it and Jet Magazine, but the New York Times, New York the New York publications and national publications were not paying attention to Black culinary during that period. And you talk about that a bit, and I'll get into that. But when you say that the best cornbread might be found in the church, you're talking about places like Sylvia's that were uptown already, or places like Jezebel that were downtown and doing some pretty damn good cornbread. So why does Marcus Samuelsson think that he would need to find the best cornbread in church?
Yeah, and I love that. And, the best for me, right? Because the one thing I knew I couldn't do was to try to do the cornbread that Sylvia was doing, because that was theirs. I've been a customer of Sylvia since they're my neighbors now, and they've been amazing neighbors. And I've been a fan of Alberta Wright and Jezebel's. As a matter of fact, I used to live across the street, and she was always kind enough to invite me to that bar because she knew I couldn't afford to sit in the dining room, but sit over here, boy, you'll be okay, and watch the action, watch me go to work. And I did watch. But so my point is, if you look at Red Rooster's menu, it's all through the lens of Blackness, but it's also telling a lens of an immigrant story. So my journey is not the journey of the migration, I'm Black. And that's the beauty of our culture, that you can be Caribbean Black, you can be coming from the South up north. And the story of the menu really tells both stories. So for us, I felt rather than do what these other iconic, the Pan Pans, the Sylvia's, the amazing restaurant that has been established for 70 years in Harlem. We can't do that. We have to tell our own story. And that's why I was looking very often. The best chicken for me was very often a jerk chicken that was served in the park, for example. So for me, it was finding the familiar, going to places like Lundell's, going to places like Pan Pan, but then what twist, what story are we trying to tell? Because it's all about being unique, right? We're not selling generic food. We're selling unique food that is a blend between there's a comfort zone there so people can understand what they're coming for and what they're going to get. But then the twist got to happen, the up's got to happen. And if you don't have a twist, you have nothing to say.
Mm-hmm. Good point. So let's go back to Jezebel for a minute and Alberta Wright. Jezebel was a legendary restaurant that a dear friend of ours, Alberta Wright, opened in the Theater District in 1983 in Manhattan. And Marcus, you recently reached out to me about a project that you were working on with Alberta, and you asked me to work on that with you. And I'm really excited and looking forward to working with you on that. Alberta was like a second mom to me. But my question, how did you discover Jezebel, and what was your reaction the first time that you walked into that magical room in the middle of the chaos along 9th Avenue?
So, I mean, like most New Yorkers coming up, I lived all over New York, right? But where I felt home was in a very chaotic block, but it wasn't chaotic to me. It was in Hell's Kitchen. And I lived for 5 years across the street from Jezebel's. And, so every morning when I went to work, I walked by it. And, the restaurant was slowly opening up, taking its garbage out, or, getting its food. Yeah. And most mornings, Alberta was there, telling everybody what to do, being very assertive. And
she could be assertive.
Oh, no, she was assertive. And there was no doubt who was the boss. And she's like, what do you want? And then, but there was always a really good conversation. She knew what I was doing. And she, on certain days, she mostly came for lunch. Used to bring one of those high-class friends that she knew, and she came for lunch. And so she knew what I was doing. I didn't know if she liked it or not. I had no idea. But so she came to Aquavit, and she always had incredible eclectic friends, right? Whether they were fashion designers or musicians.
And she could dress.
And she could dress, right? So when I came back at nighttime, when I wanted to have my nightcap with my buddies, we could never really afford to sit in the dining room. It was like, Denzel could be in the dining room. Wesley Snipes could be in the dining room, or Whitney could be in the dining room, whatever. It was just not for us. But the bar was for us. Mm-hmm. And her son came out, and it was this magical place, which also was very foreign to me, but I felt comfortable, right? And the comfort was couple of things, right? So Red Rooster is a combination of a love letter, what I saw at Jezebel's, what I saw at Dark Bar, what I saw at Sugar, what I saw at and experienced at later on K Mecca, what I saw at B Smith, and the list goes on and on and on and on, right? And it was this idea that Black people were not one or two at the table somewhere in the dining room. It was majority. And then other people could come too. And that feeling that the server were Black, and so was the bartender, but so was also the majority of people in the room. And that comfortness of that was something that really inspired me. And, I watched B do that. B Smith could work a room better than anybody. Alberta had a different style. The energy walking into Shark Bar, small, tight. When maybe Oakley comes into the room or, whatever. Yeah. And so it was a comfort zone of these incredible establishments of Black restaurants that was really, 10 years before that was really started, 15 years before that by your dad, at Cello and all of that stuff. So there is a legacy and a baton that's being passed. And Rooster wouldn't be Rooster without Van Lennox Lounge, without Showman's, without Lundell's, without Sylvia's. And it's all of that. What the Rise and the Red Rooster cookbook is. It's really a love letter to that.
Yeah, no, I feel you, man. And you bring up Shark Bar. I know we both know Michael Van, and I just, I have the same warm spot as you do, and attribute. I mean, it's important to recognize those places as, it's part of the tapestry, right, that we draw from as we move forward. When Denzel and I were looking to do a Southern restaurant, a soul food restaurant in LA, we wanted to bring Alberta out and do Jezebel. And so Georgia, what we ended up doing was initially intended to be Jezebel, and that didn't happen. But that's a story maybe for the project.
No, but I'll tell you about that. So Georgia, so I went there when I came out, right? And that was so ambitious. So that was important for me because it was important to say, okay, there's another panache, there's another way to do that. And there was actors in the room, and there was this language almost that was different, right? And as a young kid coming up, I needed to see that. It was just as important for me as to go to a 3-star Michelin restaurant when I went to France.
Right.
So I knew always that I would do Red Rooster. I just needed to go to work at it and study it. And that's the 8 years. And I felt at that point, okay, I've now done enough personal work. I've now studied. And, when you do a restaurant such as Rooster, there's 2 floors and 250 employees, you know what I mean? It's very ambitious, but you can also fall. So I had to do it in tranches. We did it in tranches. We just started with upstairs.
Yeah.
And it took us 2 years to build the downstairs. Mm-hmm. Right? And I'm glad we did in these slices. And saying that because I'm sitting here at Red Rooster Overtown now, and I thought we can open them both at the same time. Mm-hmm. The pandemic didn't step in, but the pandemic happened. And maybe we needed to be one room and handle that. And 6 months or a year later, open upstairs. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So things happen for very different reasons. Yeah. And as people, very often as men, you're so ambitious. We want to do everything. We want everything to happen right now. But, I've learned to sit back and say it's going to happen when it's going to happen.
That makes me think about, and I've said this before, that, the pandemic and the loss of life and the loss of business, of course, is tragic and would have been lovely had none of that happened. When has the entire planet ever had the same thing impacted at the very same time and caused us all to press one big giant pause button? And as a result, refocus, rethink things, pivot. That word became a very popular word this year. But do you know what I mean, Marcus? It's been like this spiritual stop, full stop, and reevaluation and issues that needed to be flushed out, the healthcare issues, the frontline worker issues. I mean, all of these were conversations that were in the pipeline, but got fully accelerated this past year.
Yeah, no, it's a very important point. And I preference that with saying all the lives that we lost is horrible, absolutely horrible. And I wish we could have responded differently, but we are where we are. And yes, is this the biggest reset that probably will happen ever? So if pivot was the word of 2020, I hope empathy can be the word of 2021. And in Africa, in South Africa, there's a word Ubuntu, which you work towards for. And having good Ubuntu is very, very important because it means that you can leave your door open and the neighbors got you. If you don't have childcare, you can drop them off at the neighbor and the neighbors got you. These are the type of things that has actually slowly started to happen neighborhood by neighborhood in America. We had to be social distance, but we figured out as communities somehow to work together. I'll tell you, on my block, we shut it down for cars this summer, and 2 neighbors just took it over and built this childcare pod and went and knocked on everyone's door. Okay, this is what we're going to do. So Marcus, food. Okay, on Sundays, provide meals for the kids and cook with the kids. You're an artist. You're going to paint with the kids. You're a gym teacher. You're going to do this. I'm a yoga teacher. And so little by little, in the safest way, our neighborhood came alive in a way, Brad, never been before. And I'm just saying that's an example of how neighbors comes together and say, hey, we can't do this anymore. We can't just sit here and be afraid of each other. We're going to do this safe. We're going to have enough distance. We're going to do it masked up, but we're not going to stop living. So there's these stories that is happening. They're not always written in the media, but they're happening. I'm sure they're happening in your neighborhood, and they're happening in my neighborhood. Those are some of the stories that I wish could come out of this too, that don't go away the day when we're back to the new norm.
I feel you, man. I feel you. I get that as you're describing it. I'm just envisioning a village and, people just reaching out. And that's certainly a spirit that we need a lot more of now. Marcus, you talk about, some of the influences and people that, you made contact with, the Thelma Goldens and various people uptown. I know I've heard you mention Tracy Kimball and Ray McGuire, our friend who's running for mayor in New York. I mean, these were some pretty influential folks that you were able to find. And I think the one thing that most people say consistently about you that we all admire is how much of a student you are, how good a student you are. A friend of mine has a saying, and I think about you because you didn't grow up here, but a friend of mine says, I might have been born yesterday, but I stayed up all night. And that reminds me of you, man. You have this curiosity and a sharp mind, because being curious is great, but you can walk into a lot of buildings just being curious and bump your head. But you have a sharp mind, Marcus, and you know how to focus what you learn and reinterpret that into words, guidance, and experience. What is that gift? How do you sharpen that tool?
Well, I've had a lot of good mentors and I've experienced many different things. Brad, I was born in a hut, and I go back to that hut, not this year, but almost every year after that, I go back to that hut. And when you stand staring at a hut and you come from that and you have your son in your hand, he's too young to understand why we're here, but it gave me enormous amount of strength. But then also I think about the mentors that saw something in me and believed in me way more before I believed in myself. And so it's a lot of that, and my parents and my grandparents. But I would also say that I've incredible uncles and aunties. Like Ray McGuire is a mentor of mine, he's a friend of mine, and he will hopefully be the mayor of New York City. I had people like Dick Parsons early, put me aside and say, hey, this is what you should do. When Dick put together the empowerment zone in the 90s, Harlem is still thriving after what Dick Parsons put together in the 90s, right? Think about that. 25 years later, it's happening, right? So I've been fortunate enough to cook for these incredible people, but they've also been in my corner and be able to have people like that and amazing people like Elizabeth Alexander and so on call on, because I didn't know how to do a book, but I've always had somebody that I could ask, okay, how do you put together a book? Or I didn't necessarily know how to buy my first apartment. Well, I had an aunt or an uncle that I could ask, right? And so I feel really privileged to being old enough to grow up in a culture where you acknowledge that, but also young enough to have the energy be able to execute. And I would also say, also, Brad, Black culture has given the world so much. There's so much there culturally, right? We talk about Malcolm, we talk about Martin, we talk about the music. So as a student being outside America, I felt I was right there. When Motown 25 happened, I tried to do moonwalk just like any other kid, right?
Sure.
And, when MTV started to show more of us, I try to do those moves and be part of that. So my point is, Black culture gets exported to the world and appreciated to the world in a much higher level than it ever gets appreciated here. And I was that one kid that they were talking to. So when you've been the benefactor and the receiver of that, you got to get back.
Yeah. Marcus, we're winding down. I have a couple of more subjects that I want to touch on, and thank you for that elaboration on that question. One of the things that the pandemic shook up a bit is the world of publishing, and I know that Dawn Davis took over as editor at Bon Appetit. You're going to be doing some guest editing work there, which is fantastic. I had been in discussions with the James Beard Foundation, their diversity officer, for years. I think I mentioned that to you a couple of years ago about the possibility of joining with them, and that never happened. The only thing that came out of that was a little article I wrote about Alberta. But, you make some really good points about the messaging and how important the narrative is. And of course, who gets to tell that narrative is important. So how do you see these changes, Dawn being at Bon Appetit, you having an opportunity there, and wherever else changes might come from? How do you see that affecting the narrative?
I think it's extremely important what's happening right now, right? And Dawn is an amazing publisher, and she knows how to navigate, know how to tell diverse stories. She's also partnered with Sonia Chopra, which is also, she's, a woman of color. And the person that is the head of all digital content and the videos is a woman, Agnes, also a woman of color, right? These were all positions that were held by white men before. The fact that these are three women of color telling these stories will shape the storytelling, right? And then you have incredible people like Toni Tipton Martin, being both in publishing and doing her own books, for example. And then, on other posts, you have incredible people like Jamila Robinson, writing for Philadelphia Inquirer, for example. So my co-author was saying, so you have in this generation, incredible Black writers that are telling their truths, are telling their stories on super important platforms. Then what's happening on social media, you have someone and beyond, right? There are new stories constantly. And you also have something that's happening in self-publishing. If you think about what Clancy Miller is doing for the culture, for example. So I don't think there's ever been a larger time and more of us sharing and telling our stories in food. And that will be game changing because people come to appreciate. How do we appreciate Italy so much? Because of tourism, because we've heard the stories. How do we appreciate France so much? Because of what's been told in books and magazines forever. Well, I hope that can now also, some of that can be shared with, let's tell the stories about Detroit. Let's aspire to go to Charleston. Let's aspire to go to Overtown. So that can't be done unless there are receivers on the other end in media that values our stuff. And that's why I think it's so important to have Don Davis at Bon Appetit. And that's why it's so important to have Tony Martin and so on. The list goes on and on. So I feel very positive about the future, both from the sort of the traditional media content providers, also what's happening, the underbelly in the social media and on TikTok, because our culture always comes from sort of a basement culture that then eventually becomes pop culture. Right. It's done so in music, done so in film, and then eventually we become the mainstream.
Mm-hmm. Very true. And there's also this interesting trend. I know I had been seeing it, and I spoke with Mashama Bailey recently, but also read Charles Blow's column where he's leaving Brooklyn, the New York Times columnist, to move to Atlanta. Mm-hmm. So, I'm talking about reverse migration and the impact that now, the food that made its way from the South north and the people who open businesses now, a lot are heading back down south. And it's going to be interesting to just see how that plays out in terms of what happens with the food and the culture and where is the culture going to mobilize now in what cities, what places in the South? How do you see that?
Well, you brought up Mashama. She's an amazing example that she could have an open restaurant in New York, but she chose to go to Savannah and do it and start a conversation there. That was amazing. And with that comes Netflix, and with that comes a center of the universe in a way, right? She launches a book from Gray and so on, right? So I do think the fact that we are not just doing it in the New York and the LA and Chicago, that we are doing it in other cities as well is super important because, one thing that I wanted to highlight in the Rise was that we focused on 45 chefs, but we really told the story of 200 chefs. And people are not just in the big cities. People are everywhere. And that's important because as people travel and as people need examples and people need places to work in to get experience in, you don't have to move sometimes. You can stay in your own city or you can move to a neighboring city. And that's why it's so important to see that our culture in terms of food is not in one city. Many cities. And I feel as we can navigate our way through the pandemic, I think this big reset, I really believe that the magic can come out of it.
I listened to a great conversation you had with Adam Weinberg at the Whitney Museum, I believe last month. And you made some really, really inspirational comments and points about food and the metaphor of the table. And, that's what I call my podcast. It's a, metaphor for that spot where you can have intimate conversation, but the power that food and restaurants have to bring people together and potentially provide an atmosphere for some of the conversations that we need to have around race. And Alice Randall, the New York Times bestselling author, speaking about Detroit, wrote wonderfully about Detroit and Black Bottom Saints, a fantastic book that she got nominated for lots of awards for. But she used an expression that she says there has to be a reckoning before reconciliation. How do you feel about that, Marcus? I mean, are we having a reckoning? Are we ready to reconcile? It still feels like there's a lot of stuff that needs to be said that hasn't gotten said.
I agree with that there has to be a reckoning. And I think that there's many incredible storytellers that helps us get there, right? And share that, right? When you think about a book like Caste from Isabel Wikison, or think about, you hear the podcast 1619 from Nicole Hannah Jones. When you think about how things are linked generationally. So it's happening a little bit in Hollywood. You can tell, like on a director level or on an acting level, it's happening slower in food, but it is happening in media. It's not as fast as we'd like. And I see all this. And then on a daily basis, you get reminded about Ahmad, Rihanna, George. You go back, and the list goes on, right? Especially now, right? You're going to hear about it every day. And there's not a day during the spring when I don't think about Ahmad Arbery. Like I'm a runner. I go to New City. One of my favorite things to do is to run. It's a free thing. Just put on sneakers, shorts, and a shirt and just go, right? I would have been running in the Brianna trails when we watched over and over that image of George Floyd being murdered right in front of us, right? We've heard those stories before, but we never visualized it in that way, right? So on one hand, it is happening, and on the other hand, I feel like we got nowhere. The incredible thing what I learned about America, it's a country of this incredible journey of push and pull.
Right.
And many things can happen at this. And it is a country where we, most of the time, land on the right side of right, but it's a hella journey of getting there. And it's ugly and it's sticky and it's a push and pull. But it's maybe our job to just push that needle, push that conversation, move it. Because that's the only way we know how.
Well, we're at the end here, Marcus, and but that's perfect for the last thing that I want to ask you about, and we don't have a lot of time, but I do want to say, you have the intellect, charisma, talent, and the growing platform to be one of the great cultural ambassadors of all time. I'm curious, that plus deeply caring about the world that Zion is going to walk through, is that what gets you out of bed in the morning?
I started my podcast because I wanted Zion to have a receipt. I wanted him to know that his daddy was vulnerable and didn't know what to do, but did something. I started finishing the project that I do, it's with him in mind, right? There is, with Zion, the coolest people in the world are the police officers who work in the park, right across the park where we live. As he's running towards them, and as they talking to him, I want to say, and I'm thinking in my own head, remember this face when he's 15. Remember him when he's 17. Mm-hmm. He's not just a cute boy now. Have him in mind. Mm-hmm. He might wear a hoodie. He might need to be corrected because he's a kid and it's going to be up to no good sometimes. And I need you to not overreact. I need you to talk to him or reprimand him. And as a parent, as a father, I have all those multiple conversations happening at the same time. And my way of expressing them, my way of dealing with that is through creating content, through food. Right. And everybody has a different process, but that's my process. That is my process.
Well, that's a beautiful imagery, man. And the idea of having the officer become familiar with Zion's face now at 10, at 15. My son's 32, and I've been having those conversations too, so I can relate. Jeff, Marcus, Samuelsson, thank you so much, man, for your time today and the energy that you continue to put out to the world, man. We need you, brother.
As I thank you to you and your entire team for putting this together. It is beautiful. Keep sharing, stay curious, and keep creating beautiful content like this. Congratulations, Brad and team. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcus. Thank you. Folks, welcome to the segment of the show that I call How We Move with Ambassador Shabazz. Ambassador, that was quite an interesting discussion with Chef Marcus Samuelsson, and I'm curious to catch some of your reflections.
Well, it was definitely wonderful and timely, and in listening to it, I just want to thank you again for incorporating me and in this collaboration, because as busy as my life is, all good, but this gives me an opportunity to pause and share the reflections while listening to them, without having to do notes on something else, but actually to take this in, digest, and also really get to appreciate the intimacy that you and your guests, in this case, Marcus Samuelsson, whom many of us in New York watched arrive. land on the shores and journey, and from a backseat we're hoping and rooting for, and to see him skyrocket and take charge, not just as a culinary chef or restaurateur, but incorporating life lessons, using his labyrinth to bring in or bridge other components. And certainly as a dad, you have to have a different dimension. It's not just you in the world, but it's making sure that what you set forth is there for the next generation, in this case, his child and others in the communities and neighborhoods. So it was a lot to hear from him, not just read about, not just a headline, and stewarded by you, knowing this course, this journey, the trajectory, generationally, the highs and the lows, while the customers are having a great time. You know what you have to manage in the back, in the front, on the side, when doors close. And so getting to hear him talk about that simultaneous to a front seat rise, so to speak, right, using the name of his book as well, that there's so much else going on. And when he juxtaposes it to being a tri-national, an African national, a European national, and now an American national, and coming from that lens, things that maybe on this side we don't really understand. Something significant that he said, well, how much American Black culture is exported. Mm-hmm. It is a kind of blueprint for many before they arrive. And do we know how to be the hosts to the newcomer?
Well, and that's a good point that you touch on, and I'm curious to get your perspective on, because as someone who has traveled as extensively as you have, and when you hear someone like Marcus Samuelsson talk about how Black culture is viewed when it is acknowledged overseas, yet, and it's ironic that we're talking about the culinary industry as a central point, because as I've alluded to on this program, and you and I have had, plenty of conversations around some of the difficulty that I've had in hiring folks from our community and enticing them into the culinary world for various reasons. Whereas Europeans and even Africans don't necessarily, and folks from the islands don't necessarily come here with that same baggage. I'm curious how you see that, balancing what you hear Marcus say, what as a native New Yorker, yet a world traveler. Where do you think our context is off there, or is this now just where we are and we're growing from here and things are improving and the voices are amplifying a different narrative?
Well, I think one of the things is that despite our classification as being, a world leader as a country, we still are a colony. Right. So that no matter how many cultures are here, or how many of us generationally as African Americans and or other cultures that are here, America almost requires that you let go of yesterday and pick up where you are. What happens when the newcomer lands at JFK or Ellis Island once upon a time, or like my grandmother by way of a ship that went to Canada and then she stepped over the border into the United States, is they come with all of that ready, jam-packed goodness and anticipation and hope and aspiration, are blindsided by us not being as ready as we promote, that we market. When I take people abroad, I very often experience Americans who are traveling with me bringing or transporting their colonial component. Now, so the thing is really learning who we are, understanding who we are, so that when he references himself as an Ethiopian by blood and origin, but influences from Sweden and journeys through France and other things, he's going to arrive to these shores Black and brown. But it doesn't mean that his experience is going to automatically start where ours is. Right. And so what is the extension that we as Africans of the diaspora, which he referenced always, to understand our variety, our uniqueness, our breadth, country by country, region by region, South versus North. I mean, I'm a Northerner and I'm living in the South, and it's learning and understanding the characteristics of people who identify themselves by the Underground Railroad, where for us in New York, it's referential, right? But it's not, front porch talk. So it's really listening, right? It's really listening and using this table format. Once upon a time, we did that. We stopped. And so pausing to have these conversations is really great. It's like yesterday, I had a meeting at 3 p.m. And I said to them, my 4:30, I'll be back in an hour and a half. That did not happen.
Mm-hmm.
What happened? I walk over. It was chilly as heck. I walked to a friend's restaurant before it opened up for dinner, thinking we can just get that done. And the conversation was so amazing, so wonderful, that I was there long enough to stay and have dinner.
Mm-hmm.
Now, because I was chilly, now, most people that know me know I don't imbibe, but they offered me a Kentucky coffee, and a Kentucky coffee similar to ones like Irish coffee.
That sounds like it might come with a little Kentucky bourbon.
Well, it came with some bourbon, sugar, and a little twist of whipped cream garnished with my favorite cinnamon. So I can only do a little bit. I could do like a capful because, I was putting hair on my chest. But he said, it'll warm you up. I said, but can I walk home? That was the question. But even significantly, when I'm there, so this is brother named Eric Batchelor, whose father was one of the renowned jockeys and trainers back in the day. And
he's an ex-NBA guy, right?
He's an ex-NBA.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And significantly has been in the restaurant industry for a couple of decades. And fine dining is his forte. It's wonderful. You go in there, but at the same...
What's his place called?
It's called Brendan's Catch 23.
Brendan's
and it's named
Catch
after
23 in Louisville.
Catch 23, named after his son Brendan. It's in memoriam to his son Brendan. And yeah, he has two children, Brendan and Erica. And when I say to you, you can feel the heartbeat of a dad's love. So when I know you and your father, I know you and your son, listening to Mr. Samuelsson make the same correlation. That his exquisite taste pre-existed his son's transition, but what you know is that he's present in the dedication of this really hip, cool, swanky place that is fine as the dining is. There are also things on that menu that are familiar to the culture, right?
Well, let's do this. And I don't know which will come first, but I am either coming to Louisville and we're going to go to Mr. Batchelor's restaurant, or you are going to meet me in Miami and we are going to have dinner at Red Rooster and then some ice cream and have them sprinkle a little bit of cinnamon on it afterwards in Overtown. Are you down with that plan?
So this is not an or, this is an and.
Right. Okay.
So we'll do both.
I just said I didn't know which would come first.
Yeah. We'll definitely do both. And I would love for people, if they're in Louisville, to stop by, bcatch23.com and look at that menu, and also know that a large percentage of what people spend goes to the foundation for children aging out of foster care.
Okay, that's beautiful. Yeah, love that. Well, Ambassador, thank you so much. And the weather's warming up, so we're going to be hitting the road here soon and coming to folks maybe from some interesting places. So
absolutely.
Nice to see you, and you have a lovely day.
You too.
Thank you.
Corner Table Talk is hosted by Brad Johnson, produced by Brad and Linda Ailes Johnson, coordinating producer Lauren Turner, theme music Life Goes On by Bryce Vine, executive producers Omar Thompson, Andrew Kalb, and Ken Johnson. Find the Corner Table Talk podcast wherever you get your podcast. Follow, subscribe, rate, and leave a comment. Corner Table Talk is a Say It Loud Network production.